As I said, John Paul is your presenter for this evening. John is a BSAC national instructor of some many years standing. He's a member of the National Diving Committee as the lead for the safety group advising the NDO. And as part of his day job, he's the training manager for the Diving Diseases Research Centre in Plymouth, which will form the core of what he's going to talk about today. But he's also going to relate it to the ongoing programme of preparing to go back diving so that we do so safely, and builds into that ongoing body of advice. So I'll hand you over to John. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Jim, for the introduction, and welcome everybody to this evening's talk. And what I'm going to run through this evening is that question: is technical diving just different kit? And that was a survey that was run in 2018, an online survey. And I expect some of you probably will have participated in that. So just to set out who and what is DDRC Healthcare, for those who are not familiar with what used to be called the Diving Diseases Research Centre, that was renamed back in 2013 for various reasons. We started our existence back at Fort Bovisand at the Underwater Centre back in 1980. And essentially our mission has been pretty much the same ever since, which is diver education, training, research into diving and hyperbaric medicine. And as you can see there, emergency recompression. And since about 2015, we've actually taken over looking after the British Hyperbaric Association helpline for England and Wales, which we staff 24/7 with a duty doctor. We also have increasingly done elective hyperbaric oxygen therapy, that is treating things like problem wounds and a number of other conditions. And it's partly because of that in the early 1990s, we looked to moving towards the then newly built regional trauma centre at Derriford Hospital. And that's our new facility, the one that we're currently in and have been since 1996. We still do a few specialist areas, wound care. We still obviously offer fitness to dive advice and do medicals, and I'm sure some of you will have been there for medicals. And we do a range of training for both divers, people in the offshore and maritime industry, and sort of in specialist areas, doctors, medical examiners of divers on the commercial side, and referees on the recreational side. And currently, or since 2019, and we're just about to start opening up, we've been working on a new project, which is a joint project with the University Hospitals Plymouth NHS Trust, Plymouth University, which is referred to as the Brain Research and Imaging Centre. And this centre houses a state-of-the-art 3 Tesla MRI scanner, which is going to be used for a range of purposes, including routine use by the hospital, research use by the university, and by ourselves for research, and particularly in relation to diving injuries. So as a centre, we basically established in Plymouth, and we have in our main chamber room itself, you can see there 4 chambers, one 50-metre capable chamber with a roll-in capacity. A couple behind it you can see on the end wall, those are slightly smaller chambers, and currently rated down to 30 meters because we're doing some maintenance. And then in the back, in another section of the facility, we've got a smaller single person chamber. So we've got a range of treatment options there at DDRC Healthcare. So the Health of Divers project, of which this is a component, has been running for 13 years almost, and this is the 9th in the suite of areas that we've looked at, and that is technical diving. We've asked what is a technical diver, and tried to establish that. That's sort of maybe not as straightforward as it seems. And we've looked at who is the population of technical divers and their health issues, and also their knowledge, understanding, skills, attitudes towards situations and behaviour. Those are the areas that I'm going to cover over during this evening. So the project is based on anonymous online surveys, and I'm sure probably some of you will have contributed to those, and obviously we're very grateful for that, because without participation from the diving community, we don't really have the option to learn things and discover things. And the responses to the various surveys over the years have been very positive in terms of numbers. So the things we look at commonly in each of the surveys is the diver and diving demographics, trying to establish a better understanding of divers' health and actually what's happening in the real world, rather than what we would like to be happening, or what in theory is supposed to be going on. What are divers actually doing? Just briefly there, the survey since 2008, there were 3 drug surveys essentially, the use of illicit drugs in diving, prescribed and over-the-counter drugs, and then going through each year or two, as you can see there, a range of other areas. And what we try and do in each of those is to try and link in between the different surveys, so we can actually identify continuing trends or changes over time, and verify from one survey to the other the sorts of responses divers are giving. The latest one, the technical diving survey, we had 614 people respond to that, which was very encouraging. And they're from a range of organisations. So from BSAC, or from members who had been trained or members of BSAC at some stage, formed about 40% of people who responded to the survey. So establishing what is technical diving, we looked at a number of different definitions, and those are some of the ones that cropped up. And it's changed through from the sort of 70s and 80s, in the earlier days, and been modified as we go along. You can see there that there are various aspects of diving that constitute, or are said to constitute, technical diving. And they includes, but not exclusively, recognizing that the individual may be exposed to hazards beyond those normally associated with recreational diving, either because of depth or because of a sealing, a physical sealing or a decompression sealing, that they may reduce those risks by having appropriate or additional skills, knowledge and experience, and using additional equipment. And that often, or more often than not, there's some change of breathing gas and use of breathing gas other than air. So we'll have a look at that as we go along. So as I say, 614 divers responded, 88% of them male and 12% female. And that was the range in terms of age and gender. And the columns are percentages of that group. So you can see that in relation to the male divers who responded, it's the blue columns, we've got a build up and then a fairly even proportion through the 40 to 60 age group, and then dropping off again into the 70s. And for the female respondents, we've got a bit more of a sort of spike there in the 31 to 40 group, as you can see, a bigger proportion of that group in that age range. And there are various factors that have been proposed for that: life commitments, health related issues, and disposable income, and various other research can be tied into that, and we've been doing further development in that area. When we compare that to the general diving population, so this is actually from the alcohol survey back in 2010, which we had 818 respondents to that survey. And you can see the profile for general diving respondents, recreational diving is slightly different. So as I expect most of you will be familiar, what we're talking about here is really two groups of divers, those using open circuit predominantly, and those using rebreathers of various kinds. And again, there's a slight difference between the two groups, with the male respondents about 50-50 split on using open circuit equipment and closed circuit or rebreathers. And within the female respondents, a slightly larger proportion who were using open circuit equipment. And various suggestions have been made as to why that is. As I say, within this group, we've got representation from 13 diving training organisations, and actually the BSAC was 41%, or 249 of the respondents were actually members or had trained as technical divers with BSAC. So they have a BSAC qualification. And then after that, the next largest group were actually PADI technical divers. Actually, a lot of members were, or a lot of the respondents rather, were members of more than one group. And the biggest proportion was actually members of TDI, or people who trained with TDI. One of the other questions we asked was the range in which they dived. So what sort of depths are we talking about? And you can see there that clearly, in a significant majority, were diving in the 40 to 60 meter range. 151,000 or 152,000 almost dives in that range. Whereas in the range greater than 100 meters of depth, we had 2,500 dives being carried out. So I suppose along the lines that we'd expect, from anecdotal experience and reports. And in relation to gases, what gases were being used? And this was actually the question here was in relation to primary gas. So we have a mixture, as you can see, of nitrox and air, slightly different proportions there. And then by far the most, we're actually using normoxic trimix. So gives us a bit of an idea of what the gas is being used. And interestingly, we've got a percentage there at the bottom, a small percentage, who are actually using heliox rather than a trimix mixture. And various experiences coming back from that. We also looked at thermal protection, and again, there are a couple of things that we were particularly interested in here. As you can see, about 85% were using dry suits. I think most of the respondents were probably diving in UK or northern temperate areas, and 15% wearing wetsuits or semi-dries. And one of the things that was of interest here particularly was whether there was a link between the use of dry suits and P-valves and nappies and things like that, and the levels of hydration that divers would accept prior to the dive. And we've still got some work to do on that one. Essentially, you can see there that 43% of the dry-suited divers had a P-valve fitted to the suit, and then 4% of them used nappies, and 2% actually using a P-zip. But it's interesting because I think it was probably aimed towards which was their sort of primary use, which they more often use. And also a good number there, an increasing number actually using heated vests. And how they use the heating vests was one of the questions we asked. So a significant number of divers actually not turning the vest on until they got towards the end of the dive and using it for heating, generating warmth or increasing body core temperature during the decompression phase, the latter phase of the dive. And the question here, I suppose, was does that actually link to knowledge, to some of the work that, for example, Neil Pollock has been doing in relation to the reduction in the likelihood of DCI by making sure that one's warm at the end of the dive and not cooling off at that stage. Other things about this population? Well, as you can see there, 14% were using full face masks, and that presents obviously an element of protection potentially with against gas toxicity and losing consciousness. And you'll be aware we didn't actually cover that or raise that question at the time of this survey, but you'll be aware there's been some discussion about mouthpiece retaining straps and the usefulness of them in achieving this similar effect. And some 12% of the divers were cave divers. So then, having established who we were looking at and in general terms, the nature of their diving, what we then went into is the health and fitness side of things. And body mass and the status of divers in terms of their body weight is something that we've looked at in a number of surveys. Actually, before this Health of Divers series started in the early days, we did some work on that as well. And of those who took part in the survey, you can see there were none actually who reported themselves as being underweight. We had the sort of reasonably significant 1/3 of the group who reported themselves as being at a healthy BMI, and then a fairly large section who identified themselves as being overweight in terms of BMI. And BMI is not a perfect measure, but it's quite a useful measure. Of course, there are different things that can contribute to weight against height. And so what we're actually doing in one of our more recent surveys, which is ongoing at the moment, is actually including in that, in addition to height and weight, we're looking at waist measurements as well to try and give us a bit of an idea of what we've got in the population. So that in itself has proved to be a little bit of an issue, and we'll be posting on that in the near future. But one of the problems with, I suppose, unexpected, possibly, problems with asking people for waist measurements is that it was clear that what we're actually getting in some of the surveys was their waist size, clothing waist size, which were falling into sort of 34s and 36s and whatever, rather than an actual measurement of the individual's waist. So again, we've got to try and work around that, see if we can get something meaningful out of it. Again, looking at other areas in terms of health and fitness, we had 31% of the group reported having one or more of the following health issues, and you can see them listed there. By far the most common were depression and high blood pressure, and again, I don't think that's altogether surprising. So a range of issues represented there. And of those, some 14% were currently receiving medical care. So what we're looking at there, or what we're hearing from the respondents, is that some of them are still actually undergoing medical care and appear to be continuing to dive. 24%, which is actually fairly similar to other surveys, were taking prescribed medication. And the last session I did was on some of the other research projects, and the 2010 alcohol survey showed about 21% taking medications. So it's sort of fairly similar. And the drug survey in 2008 showed about 23% on prescription or over-the-counter medications. So again, very similar. And of course, taking the medications in themselves is not an issue. It's whether there's been any consideration of conflict between those medications and diving, and also, of course, conflict with technical diving in particular, where we might be exposed to perhaps slightly different and more demanding situations and conditions. So of the technical diving respondents, a fitness to dive survey had been carried out, and 73% of them had actually had a face-to-face consultation with a diving medical specialist, which is quite a high proportion. And again, probably a little bit higher, as you can see, than we found in previous surveys. Now, whether that's a recognition of the nature of technical diving, we weren't or haven't yet been able to establish. However, of that 73%, 12% were more than 10 years previously or prior to the survey in 2018. And again, there could be different reasons for that, for the 10-year gap. It may be that they were examined, that it was a transient condition, or it may be that they were signed off for a period of time. We don't actually know that for certain, but it does raise the question, was it a positive response, or did the individuals just stop being a sit diving medicine referee? 27% of the group had never had a medical examination carried out by a diving medical specialist. Again, not surprising, because of course, if we can answer no to all the questions on our self-declaration medical, then we don't need to consult a diving medical referee. So again, there's probably a good explanation for that. What's more concerning, though, is that 30% of those divers did report having a health issue. So those 27% who'd not had a diving medical examination, nearly a third of them did actually report having a condition which they would have had to answer yes on the self-declaration medical form. So it appears that those were undeclared or undisclosed medical conditions, which might have an impact to varying degrees on their health and their safety underwater, and an impact on other people. And perhaps even more concerning, but a very small proportion, 17 of those people, just 3%, had actually been refused a diving medical certificate and were continuing nonetheless to dive. And this even to even greater extent raises the question of individuals' awareness of the impact or potential impact of putting themselves in this situation, but also the impact on those they dive with, whether they're buddies, fellow divers, dive managers, or whatever. And of course, at this time, we're returning from COVID, going back into diving. And one of the things we would strongly recommend is that everybody seriously thinks about their level of fitness to dive. And that's not just their medical fitness. Jim's certainly been posting a lot of suggestions and ways forward in terms of making sure that we're physically fit and considering mental fitness to dive as well. And particularly when we think about technical diving, where we've got the extra pressures, the need perhaps for being able to process more complicated tasks and to respond to more complex situations. We then went on to look at hydration as an issue, and thoughts about hydration have changed over time. And one of the things we were interested in really was, are divers keeping up with hydration and the advice on hydration? Particularly when we're talking about technical divers who can be immersed or submerged and breathing gas, particularly open circuit divers for extended periods of time. And it was quite positive, really, that we found that 73% actively hydrated. And of course, there's an issue here, because what we actually want or need people to do to be safe and to give them an element of reduced chance of decompression illness is to be adequately hydrated. So preloading, overhydrating, doesn't actually help, and it does have potential or could cause potential complications, one of which, immersion pulmonary edema, we're becoming ever more aware of. So 73% actively hydrated. And I think from what we see in other parts of the survey, that they're probably making sure that they are adequately hydrated rather than overhydrating. And we're looking at people drinking, a litre or 2 litres of fluid. Now, depending on where one is and what the weather's like and other factors, then that probably is a reasonable amount of fluid. We had 94% said they didn't actively dehydrate. So again, one of the questions that arose out of that, and I haven't got the breakdown on it yet, was how many of those were actively dehydrating, maybe because they didn't have a means of dealing with urinating during the dive. So, are there dry suit divers who were actively dehydrating because they didn't have a system for offloading urine during the dive? In the pre-dive hydration, 91% were taking water, 56% tea and coffee, and only one diver in this survey on that question actually was pre-hydrating with alcohol, which is reassuring, really. Yep, a few people have come back with questions in relation to tea and coffee being appropriate and the diuretic effect of caffeine. Generally, the research shows that effect in sort of regular tea and coffee, rather than extra strong versions, is actually not an issue, that it doesn't actually cause a significant level of dehydration. So that all looks pretty good, that people are making sure they are hydrated adequately. Just got a flash up on my screen there. Wait a minute. Rehydration post-dive. And again, this is rewarding because it suggests that people are aware of the benefits of post-dive rehydration. 78% of those who responded said they did actively rehydrate post-dive. And again, in terms of what they were doing in the 2 hours post-dive, similar-ish results in terms of taking water, tea, coffee. As you can see, a larger group using alcohol. And again, post-dive with, reasonable cautions. I think that's probably not unreasonable, depending on what they're going to be doing next. But yeah, so there appears to be an awareness of the benefit and the significance of rehydrating post-dive. So having looked at hydration, we then asked questions on various situations that had confronted these divers, and 67% reported one or more incidents, and some actually reported quite significant clusters of incidents over periods of either many years or just a few years. And just have a quick look at some of the incidents that they talked about. So in terms of planning and preparation, and these ones covered both open circuit and rebreather divers. These are the sort of things that cropped up. This part of the survey was actually a little bit led in that we had some options, drop-down options for divers to check if they'd encountered them. So one of the areas, the first one, they're unable to return to stage deco gas, which was cached to be picked up later. This was put in there really because there was a feeling that a practice which was fairly common a number of years ago of actually leaving gas, immediately required decompression gas, on the bottom of the shot and things like this, probably reduced, and that's sort of supported by the result of the survey. So failure to monitor usage, gas usage, and changing plans during the dive was the next most significant one. There's actually quite a significant, 5% discovered at some point during the dive that had incorrect gas in the cylinder. So a couple of comments in the free text, like, that I told the dive shop to put this gas in my cylinder, and when I actually ran the gas, that wasn't what I'd got. Again, looking at responsibility for the gases that an individual's carrying. A similar number had or carried out incorrect gas switches in open circuit diving. So again, is this down to cylinders being adequately marked up and maybe having a set or standard configuration as to where one carries particular gases for switches? But again, 5% encountered that as a situation. And even a larger number, 12%, who became positively buoyant due to gas consumption, or actually in one or two cases are some other factors. For example, using a different set of gear, not taking a camera on a dive, and not having thought about the consequences of that. And then a very significant 25% who experienced loss of gas during a dive. And the majority of those were hose failures, where low pressure hoses, intermediate pressure hoses ruptured or failed during a dive, and an equal number probably of free flows of secondary regulators and bailout gas regulators. So again, linking back to the current situation, making sure your equipment is adequately serviced and is going to be able to stand up to the rigors of diving is an important factor. And a lot of these free text responses in relation to those identified that maybe it was something they'd been planning to do, was to get the regulator serviced, or identified that they'd actually felt some kind of leakage prior to the dive, but nonetheless gone on to dive. I think the old adage of the incident pit, if you've got a small problem, sort it out, deal with it, don't dive with it, because you don't know what's going to happen next. The only thing you can say, I think, particularly positively about this group is they clearly all managed to resolve the issue they were confronted with, because they all survived and made or responded to this online survey. So clearly training kicked in, or they were lucky. And there's also this extra bit I put in, really, the 24% arrived at the dive site and found it was deeper than planned. And in some of those cases, the individuals were actually, even before the dive, having shot at the site, either the boat skipper or somebody else had actually given them an inaccurate estimate of the dive depth. So the result of that was a good number of them. As you can see, they're actually updated their plan slates. Many individuals reported having plus and minus 5 meter bands on each side of their planned dive, other ways of dealing with this. And the incorrect or predicted gas consumption calculations at 24% were actually mostly encountering currents, unexpected currents, or having to work unexpectedly hard during a dive. So again, pointing to planning issues, and again, really to the message that's being clearly broadcast at the moment, and that is, start simple, start, relatively shallower than maybe you might normally dive, and build up. Make sure your equipment's well serviced and checked out in advance before you carry on and progress into the deeper range of diving. So that was the planning and preparation side, and that applied, as I say, to open circuit and rebreather divers. And then picking out rebreather issues specifically, these were the sort of top scoring ones, really, the most interesting, I guess. Again, incorrect bailout gas. The free text responses to these indicated that essentially individuals weren't checking the gas that they were taking on the dive. And in a couple of instances, the gas wasn't marked up adequately. So having a system in line with our current training protocols, really, is a good idea. Just over 5% have suffered or experienced flooding of the rebreather loop and had to go bailed out because the system was unusable. What were the causes of those floodings? Well, they range from manual addition valves unscrewing on counterlungs, mouthpieces and hose failures in a couple of cases, and on T-piece failures. So again, equipment assembly, properly checking equipment, making sure it's properly assembled before we dive. And again, linking a few of these probably checklists, going through a checklist of some kind or a system of some kind, making sure that the equipment's fully usable. High CO2 levels, again, highlights the issue about not being distracted when you're assembling a rebreather. And a majority of these identified, actually, no, a significant minority, but a good number of that 7% identified that they'd failed to properly assemble the scrubber unit. They'd left a component out during the assembly process. A couple saying that it was because of a distraction. So, if we're actually going through the process of assembling a piece of equipment that's going to be critical to our life, we really need to focus on making sure we do it properly. And of course, the other one was that in a few cases, they identified post-dive on examination of their scrubber that they were settling and channeling, often due to traveling by vehicle to the dive site, to the boat, and perhaps not having packed the rebreather canister adequately, and some suggesting it was actually from rough boat rides as well. And we know from experience that some of these are probably down to extended use of scrubbers, perhaps beyond the manufacturer's recommendation. But there were only, I think, 2 of those that were reported in the self-reporting survey. Partial pressure absorption in the loop being either too low or too high. Again, quite a significant number there, and linked in, some of them certainly linked into oxygen sensor cell failure during the dive. And the divers will be aware that we've gone through a long period of time where maybe oxygen sensor cell reliability hasn't perhaps been all that it might be. So we've got within the free text there reports of numerous problems with cells failing to read even within the first 12 months of their life, and leakage and bits and pieces like that. Quite a few in terms of covering or moisture on cell faces. And of course, again, as with the previous group, these are all survivors. So these individuals have all managed the situation to the extent that they've survived the encounter. And I suppose that's reassuring, and it probably reflects on the nature of our training programs. But again, highlighting adequate checking, making sure the equipment we're using is servicing, not pushing out the limits. So, you know, cells have well-defined lifespans, and they're usually fairly conservative to give us safety margins. If we push those out, then we're likely to encounter issues. And importantly, and again, seeing this from the free text, is actually the confidence in people doing cell checks when they start to get erratic readings. And again, a few of the respondents identifying that they weren't confident and comfortable in checking linearity and the reaction of cells underwater. Looking at decompression illness, we had, and we're looking at a slightly different angle here. We have actually done a DCI and denial survey, as some of you will be aware. What we're looking at here is non-reporting particularly, and 23% of the respondents actually felt that they had suffered signs and symptoms of decompression illness but didn't report it. And they did, a lot of them reacted in different ways, but they didn't report the DCI. They dealt with it in one way or another. 75% of that group actually just drank fluids post experiencing symptoms and signs. 65%, as you can see, used surface oxygen, and 26% self-administered pain relief. Now, clearly oxygen and fluids are a valid first aid measure, but they are just that. They're a first aid measure. And if we administer and start to use a first aid measure, then the next step really needs to be to talk to a diving medicine specialist and get advice on whether or not, you know, I as an individual or the person that you're dealing with needs to actually take the next step and go to medical services, go to recompression chamber or whatever else might be appropriate at the time. That actually did surprise me that it was quite as high. I mean, I know a lot of people anecdotally who do self-treat, but those were quite high figures really coming out of the survey. And the problem with that is it can, can catch you out. And certainly a number of the patients that I've been involved with treating over the years have, prior to them arriving at DDRC or arriving at another chamber, have actually presented with DCI on several instances or several dives prior to that, and self-treated, and then actually then been overwhelmed by a very significant illness, often paralysis. So I suppose, and we haven't actually linked this into these ones, but one of the questions that I would ask is, what was the presentation? And I would guess through, again, through experience of dealing with divers DCI, that these were probably all presentations such as skin rashes, mild joint pain, things that weren't actually interfering with somebody getting on with their life. So again, of the group, just 19% actually reported or diagnosed with DCI and treated in the chamber. So not very different to the general population, really. And 35% of them were in a group who had not reported DCI on another occasion. That's 35% of those 190 who were treated. And these are some of the ones I was talking about, where we talk to patients in the chamber and they say, well, yes, on previous dives, I've had skin rashes and other presentations, but I've self-treated and it's gone away, so I've thought nothing of it. Of course, that's fairly critical, because very often that's a flag, a warning that something's going on, and maybe that person needs to modify their diving habits or behavior. Oh, what happened there? Not sure what I did there. No, all's right. Sorry about that. I'd lost it there. Again, a bit concerning really that 16% of those who respond, that's 96 divers, reported in the survey that they had dived and gone on a technical dive when they think they would have been over the limit to drive a car. Given the additional requirement for being mentally and physically alert, carrying out a technical dive of any significance, this is a sort of worrying figure, really. Does tie in with the general diving population, recreational population. Again, the 2010 alcohol survey showed around 19% of divers in the 800 and odd in that particular study reported they'd dived when they would have been unfit to drive a car. So again, perhaps a little bit of need for a greater awareness and understanding of the issues there. Flying with DCI, from this group, we had 8 technical divers who boarded a plane when they thought they had signs and symptoms of DCI. And the questions that come up there really are why? Why would you board a plane, when you're already suffering from DCI, and what are the consequences? In the free text responses, some of those were just concerned they hadn't got the resources to stay in that place and be treated. They had to get back. They hadn't got the time or the money or whatever else. And generally, they appeared to just hope that there wouldn't be a consequence of it. In reality, most of them did have a worsening of the situation. And of course, that's not only an impact on the individual, but if you just got onto a plane load of people coming back from their holiday and you present with a significant level of DCI, then that could be an aircraft diversion, and everybody is going to be affected by it. So again, probably a bit more thought about not only the individual circumstances and how we're going to deal with them. If we're doing extended and technical diving overseas, then having the resources or the plan to deal with things not working out quite as we expected. So just to wrap up on this, what's this particular study shown us? Some of the things really that have come out of it are that certainly divers do appear to be aware of the benefits of being adequately hydrated before the dive, and need for rehydration afterwards. And without going into the physiology of that, it's well reported, and there's some good other resources for looking more at that if you're interested. The reports on issues with rebreathers, the loop floods, the cell failures and things, not desirable, because again, many of them point to poor planning, poor servicing of equipment. But on the positive side, at least it suggests that the training that individuals been given has actually been adequate to ensure that they survive the situation, and are now been able to complete the study. So I think with the rebreather challenges, one of the things that came out particularly was understanding and being skilled in assessing cell function before and during a dive. And there were self-reports there of lack of confidence, and certainly we've in other studies, not this one, but we've seen data to suggest that people will just scroll through their handsets, trying to work out how they're actually going to assess whether or not their cells are functioning adequately, or which cells are actually functioning. So given the need in technical diving for being mentally alert, and perhaps even more so given the constraints and the limits, the overhead ceilings, drugs and alcohol, I would say, are fairly obviously contradictory to this sort of diving. I mean, obviously I'd say they were contradictory to any sort of diving, but more so with technical diving. Breeze, yeah. It's also shown us again, and it's something we've seen in other surveys, that the age profile of the technical diving population features divers who've essentially grown into their health problems, and for whatever reason, maybe not wanting to modify or have to give up parts of their diving, have continued to dive regardless of the risks. And that's not only the risk to themselves, of course, but the risks to fellow divers and the impact on other people who are either on the dive site and involved with the dive, or maybe not. So again, I think just encouraging divers to think about those issues and consequences. As I've indicated, a significant number of technical divers appear to have failed to disclose health issues that may affect diving safety. And again, perhaps maybe more responsible attitudes towards using alcohol and or drugs. So the message with this is, first of all, that we need to really think about what we're doing. Self-certification, as we've identified, relies on the diver recognizing the potential impact of not being truthful, the impact on themselves and others. And there is a question as to whether technical diver training should include a broader base of information addressing health issues. Having said that, we do cover a lot of non-technical issues like attitude and behavior, acceptance of the elevated level of risk potentially. We do cover that in the training programs, but maybe there needs to be a bit more reinforcement, and maybe even a bit of group responsibility in persuading people to act responsibly. I think we're pretty much there for that. Just highlighting here that on the DDRC Healthcare website, we have available now, and the link there does go to it, but it's still not particularly useful at the moment. It's www.ddrc.org, and you can find in the education section there that presentations on alcohol and diving, asthma and diving, diabetes, DCI and denial, and illicit drugs specifically is or are on that website. And also with them are some leaflets on drugs and alcohol and cardiac health and its impact on diving. So that's something you might want to take a look at later on. And then just to finally remind you, if you're not already aware, that the next safety seminar in this series, which is going to be presented by Jim Watson on skills refreshing, is on Monday the 12th. That's next Monday, same time, 7:30 p.m. So we look forward to seeing you there. And of course, we've got a range of resources on the BSAC website, preparation for return to diving and COVID guidance.